So the good news is I'm very excited about this event. If we had done this even 10 days ago, we would be talking about completely different topics because so much has happened in the last 10 days. Part of that is artificial intelligence, and part of that is how are we managing cybersecurity into this process. And the thing that I want to note is when we're talking about these things is remember when we're talking about cybersecurity, we're just not talking about the act of cybersecurity. We're talking about all of these systems, all these IT systems that isn't necessarily tech, but everybody who uses technology. And I'm going to highly encourage you to ask questions. I've been doing cyber for a long time, and there are days I look at these things and I'm like, I don't even know exactly what this is. To be very honest, I used Claude this morning. I put a bunch of notes on things I was working on, and I was like, I'm not so sure about some of these acronyms. Make me an acronym referral chart. So just in my notes, I had 47 acronyms. That's how it goes. So anybody wants my acronym chart, either come see me or I'll send it to you because that might be helpful because they love to make up acronyms fast and furious. And if you were dealing with ag stuff on one day and then cyber on the next day, you may have that one acronym in your head and it's not the same thing. We've got a great panel today. So I'm joined by Liz Turnell from Comcast and Prem, sorry, I'm not going to say your last name. Okay, because after the conversation, New America Open Technology Institute, and Ari Schwartz from Venable, and Kate Charlotte from Google, who just came in this morning. So she's off a red eye. So she's probably going to be really smart, but be gentle when it comes to the questions. So the couple of things that we are going to focus on is the presidential executive order that came out on June 2nd, and then how it dovetails into the things that have happened previously, not only just in cyber, but with this administration, there was some AI foundational things that are not completely clear where we're going to land on this. So we're going to have a good discussion about that. So we are going to start with just the threat landscape on how is AI fundamentally changing the cybersecurity threat environment right now, and what are we doing about some of these things, especially since Mythos came out? Because I feel like Mythos was such a big game changer, and I know other companies will say, we were already worried about these things, but maybe Anthropic just made us say it out loud, and then they just put their tool out on the market. There's a little bit of a thought about that, but just the AI fundamental question. I'm going to start, actually, Kate, with you, because I know you deal with this very much on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks everybody for joining. I'm Kate Charlotte. So I lead Google's public policy teams for privacy, safety, and security, previously at the Department of Defense cyber policy. And one of Google's units is the Google Threat Intelligence Group. So I think starting on the threat question is a good one for us. And I think it's clear we've been very much we've all been talking now about AI and cybersecurity, and this conversation has really ramped up, and that is a very good thing. But it is worth remembering that this is a trend line, a threat trend line that has been taking place for several years. So our threat intelligence group has been monitoring this threat. I think early on, you were seeing threat actors adopt AI in the context that we were all initially adopting AI in terms of making our workflows more efficient, maybe making phishing emails a little bit higher quality, have more grammar, fewer red flags. But what we've been seeing over the course of time is that AI-driven cyber threats are becoming more and more sophisticated, and threat actors are using AI across the threat lifecycle, whether that's finding and exploiting vulnerabilities, whether that is helping to create exploits. So in our most recent report last month, we published that we saw the first time that an actor had found and exploited a zero-day vulnerability using AI. So we're starting to see that. We're starting to see threat actors use AI to do agentic orchestration, so scale and speed, and of perhaps real-time evade defenses, or use autonomous malware, so have payloads that work autonomously, that interact with the victim device or execute on commands without necessarily going back to a human. So we're seeing the capability increase. And I would maybe say we should get into the defense side of this, because I think the news is not all bad in that AI tools, if we do it the right way and we spend the time driving and investing in AI tools for cyber defenders, really poses the opportunity to flip the advantage towards the defenders. But that's going to take work. And I think there's going to be, in the short term, quite a bumpy ride over the next 12 to 8 months while that shift takes place.
Ari, you're going next.
Yes, Ari Schwartz, Venable, so the executive director of the Cybersecurity Coalition. I've spoken to 3 of our members that were part of the Glasswing, the Mythos first run. I think probably most of our members have been involved in some way, but 3 of them were able to give me some details. So just to give you a sense of what's different today. So this is last 6 months. We're not talking about changes beyond that. One company told me, and all of them were in this range, but one gave me some very specific numbers of that 2 years ago, there were 50 known exploits for new vulnerabilities for all their software. So they had 50 big patches to basically put together very quickly. Mythos is finding them, it's now 40 a day. So that's 300 times the change there in terms of what they have to do. And they had less staff to do it already. So than they did 2 years ago. So that particular company. That just gives you a sense. The other thing is, in terms of days to exploit, so we used to think of some of these will take 2 weeks to exploit. This one is like a bigger one. Maybe it'll take some months to exploit. When Mythos brings you a vulnerability, it brings the exploit code with it. So it is exploitable at the time that they find the vulnerability. So that means that it's not theoretical. None of this is theoretical. When we used to talk about vulnerabilities, some of it was theoretical. Now it is all instantaneously something that they must fix immediately. So just to give 2 examples of what makes things different.
Great. And Liz, maybe you can talk a little bit to where that comes in at the level of being a Comcast and an operator, because you have so many people, your customers are riding on this, and you've got a level of protection. I'm a Comcast customer here in DC, and I just know that if Comcast says that somebody's trying to break in my system, I say, cool, they know what's going on, and I don't question it. Sometimes I do look it up, only because I'm a DNS geek and I like to look at the URLs, but yeah.
Sure. Thank you, Shane. I'm Liz Chernow. I'm Associate Vice President for Public Policy at Comcast here in our DC office. And a little bit about us. We operate the largest converged network in the nation. Half of all U.S. broadband traffic crosses our network. So we support over 30 million customers with over 1 billion devices. That includes residential, small and medium businesses, and government, state and federal and local government customers. So we are one of the biggest critical infrastructure operators in the U.S. And we know that we have a lot of assets that we need to protect, and we take that responsibility very seriously. We go to great lengths to secure our networks and the services that we provide to our customers by deploying best-in-class cybersecurity defenses and practices throughout our network. And we focus really on 3 North Stars when it comes to our security products and practices. We operate on zero trust principles across our entire enterprise. We use AI to improve our security as well. We're also building security into all of our products. Within this context, AI presents both challenges and opportunities for us. On one hand, we leverage AI to detect and manage the complex threats that are trying to get into our network. We make tools available to our small and medium business customers to empower them to secure their networks as well and to help them with that. On the other hand, we receive a lot of cyber attacks, both AI generated and otherwise. And with these new frontier models, Mythos really was the first that we were seeing, but we fully expect more to be coming at us. It made it clear that we need to ask ourselves who needs to be able to have these capabilities before the capabilities are in the hands of attackers. Because if an attacker can use a frontier AI model, and as Ari said, with the exploitation code readily available, then as a defender, we need to be able to find the issues early and harden our networks against these issues.
Okay, Prem.
Yeah, so Prem Trivedi with the Open Technology Institute at New America, a think tank here in DC. And
Can you guys hear him?
Is he okay? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Work on a number of tech policy issues, primarily at the intersection of AI governance, privacy and data security, and responsible data use. And so if you're operating at that intersection, you can't ignore everything that's happening in the sort of scary and to some extent promising environment in cybersecurity that AI models, advanced frontier models, are driving right now. I think, Shane, you wrote a piece in late April talking about what Mythos teaches us about the bill that's coming due on decades worth of accumulated cybersecurity technical debt, which I think is worth highlighting. So we've got these known sets of vulnerabilities where often newer modern tools are stacked on top of older systems. There are lots of legacy vulnerabilities, and think about power grid, think about maybe hopefully better dealt with in banking, but go down the sectors where you think about that's critical infrastructure that has both national security implications as we think of them from a state perspective, but also national security and people security implications as we think of them from an ordinary consumer and American perspective. And what Mythos has done on the scary side of the house is, I think, make those decades of accumulated technical debt now a live attack surface. And so it's enabling at industrial scale the exploitation of those decades of accreted and slowly patched, if patched at all, vulnerabilities. And we have these sort of crazy numbers. Ari spoke to them a little bit. So Mythos and Glasswing partners using Mythos surfaced something like 10,000 plus critical flaws in a period of weeks, I think. And the sense that what is being discovered as a vulnerability is, to Ari's point, immediately weaponizable really constricts rapidly, I think, the question of how much time you have to respond to those vulnerabilities. And so I think I share the optimism that I think advanced AI cyber tools pose offensive challenges. They also pose defensive potential. But I think what's interesting from the perspective I sit in is we also know that the patching problem is an institutional coordination problem. It's a human resource and system problem. And that's where I think my highest level of fear is. Not that we aren't going to have some nerd harder technical tools to employ on the defensive side, but that we're really going to have to work hard to address coordination problems that have bedeviled our systems for decades. That's what scares me most.
So I'm just going to add, so technical debt, I did write a blog about this a couple weeks ago. And the challenge is, especially the older you are as an institution, the more possibility of having technical debt, because you have a lot of legacy systems that at some point might have made sense, but they're still hanging around. And then they may be lesser used, so somebody's not doing the patching on them, or they didn't get updated. Sometimes the companies go out of business and you still have them in your system. And those are the ones that the criminals love those, because it's like, I forgot I had a window on the third floor and it's really accessible from my neighbor's house and you didn't close it. That's become a huge challenge. And now I'm going to move to what Kate, because you're right, this is where we get to the defensive posture. If you're on the defensive posture, you're having to look at everything to SWAT at all the time. If you're the criminal intent, you just need that one access point that gives you the space. So talk about how much more challenging that has come in the last couple months.
Yeah, and I'll talk also about the potential to flip that. So I think on the defense side, AI for cyber defenders, which is, I think, where we should all be really thinking about how to accelerate that. There's a short term and there's a long term in this. In the short term, using AI tools for vulnerability detection. That's what we've all been talking about. That's what Glasswing has been for. And then, to your point, you then remediate it, you patch it, but you still run into the problems of classic patching. You have to create the patch and apply the patch. But AI tools can also help to automate that as well, to generate and apply the fixes. That's something we are working on. We have a tool called Code Mender. So it's not just identifying the vulnerabilities, it's actually fixing them. So I think that kind of research and that area is a really important potential. But then over the long term, you could embed AI in the code, the software code development process, embed it as you're building code from out of the gate, making sure that it's more secure out of the gate. So you see over that long term the potential for the vulnerabilities to just not come into being in the first place. Obviously, that's the goal. That's easier said than done. But then you can also see, just as we're seeing threat actors use AI to move laterally to automate aspects of the threat attack cycle, you can also use AI for defenders to automate and understand environmental risk, quickly move to mitigate that risk, to see threats as they arise. And so you see these opportunities to have more of an environmental protection using AI for cyber defense.
And so, Liz, when I think about you all, you have to look at this from both sides, because you're not only delivering content to people and the ability to use the internet, but you also have them going the other direction, and they may be creating one of your smaller clients actually may be causing part of the challenge. So you have a very large task at hand there. And you do it very well, but I know that it's just gotten that 10x probably isn't even enough, maybe 100x harder. How are you guys managing through that?
We have a very deep bench of cybersecurity professionals, and we do use AI tools to harden our network and to secure our customers. We agree that patching does remain an area that could use some support. And I think there's the vendor side and there's also the open source side. It's a complicated problem, and it's really good to see that we're having a lot of those conversations now to come together now that we know how much more patching is going to be needed.
Are you shaking your head on the open source?
Yeah, I agree with several of the things that just said. Getting AI to write patches is the opposite side of this equation, and you could do that. Also, in the past, we used to say, oh, our code is written in an old language that has a lot of known problems with it. We can't rewrite our entire code base to move it up. Now you can rewrite your entire code base. It is a project that AI can help you do. So there are some things that are structurally long-term, very positive things for the defenders can do. There's some problems involved in that, which is you have to take resources off of other things to make some of those longer term things happen and to address those issues. And it seems to be, we're finally having this discussion here about how expensive it actually is to use the AI. And not just expensive in terms of getting people to use the right prompts and things like that. The actual tokens to use it is expensive. And the defensive side of this, the writing code, et cetera, seems to be more expensive than the finding of the vulnerabilities does. So from what people have been telling me. So there's concern on that side. And then there's also the role that a person has to be with the AI is harder on that side as well. So it's more expensive from a resource side on both ends of this. And a lot of EOs, a lot of executives that have been thinking about AI, it's hard for them to get their head around. We also need more people with using more AI, which is going to be more expensive than we thought it was, all at the same time. It's not, that hasn't really sunk into a lot of the calculation here of, and certainly hasn't sunk into Wall Street where they're saying, oh, you should cut jobs so you can save money and invest in AI instead. That's just not the way this is going to work if we're going to get to the point of actually being more secure. So,
Prem, do you have anything to add on the defense side?
Yeah, just a couple of points echoing and synthesizing what folks have said. I think, so what's the potential on the defensive side? So AI allows lots of institutions, companies to do continuous discovery, continuous triage, and then to generate patches as well, not just flag a vulnerability across all the surfaces in an organization. That's something that even the best teams working with the best tools, say 12 to 18 months ago, couldn't match at that kind of scale and presumably that accuracy. I think it's really interesting, just to quickly pick up on Ari's point, we keep having these sort of business and market conversations about an AI bubble, which I'm not here to speculate on, but the point being, companies are pouring tremendous amounts of money into developing these models. And so they're getting more and more advanced. Money keeps pouring in. I had this question in my mind, and I had a bit of an instinct, which you seem to be confirming, which is that the defensive side of the house now is going to become incredibly expensive. And that is just going to be a resource challenge to layer along human coordination challenges we've been talking about. It'll be interesting to watch. I think there's a lot of defensive potential that this panel has emphasized. Cost is an interesting thing to watch.
One of our members called this summer Patch Summer. We're going to be patches all the time, but it also means rewriting a lot of code and pulling people off that we're doing new features to products and taking them off of that to redo the code and rewrite things and to use AI in a positive way and get them trained in the right way to use AI in that way. So that is like where a lot of people are headed right now.
That's a really good point. Quick two-finger on that too is we're in a very commercially competitive AI frontier model and even sub-frontier model race. And so those are going to be some tough questions for companies to make, which is like, how much time do we take off of next-gen product and AI integration, next model development, and how much do we put into that defensive side of the house is going to be interesting. And I think you're going to have downstream users of frontier models that are going to face their own set of how much time do I spend innovating with these tools and bringing go-to-market products out? How much time do I spend dealing with accumulated technical debt?
And just one point on the patching too. I spend a lot of time talking to our cybersecurity teams, and it's not just putting a Band-Aid on a cut. You actually have to validate the patch, make sure it works, make sure that when you're patching in one place, you're not taking down something else. So it is a very resource-intensive process.
There's two analogies I really like because I think it helps visualize for those of us who are visual thinkers. One is that it's like shining a black light. Like all of a sudden you think you've got everything clean and then you shine a black light and you're like, oh, I've missed a lot of things here. And then the other one is as far as it's also like you just dropped the keys to every system in the room and said, you might not just go ahead, just the keys there, go ahead. It's like staying in a hotel and every door just opened and you're like, okay, how are we going to, and its expedience is very important. So part of this is a timing issue. So I'm going to get to the government parts of this because this is where it gets very interesting, especially for you all in the room. So the recent president's executive order creates a clearinghouse, which Ari's very excited about. He can talk about the clearinghouse for a long time. But it coordinates the vulnerability scanning, validation, patch distribution we were just talking about. And it's very important. But if this isn't, again, just an IT, this isn't just a tech company problem. It is critical infrastructure operators throughout. So hospitals, banking has issues on this. Now we're talking about a lot of coordinated effort that we need to do in this space. And as probably you all know in the room, we've had some challenges with CISA, with funding and the things that we are asking them to do. So Ari, since you're a big fan, can you just give us the baseline on why the clearinghouse is important and how it functions?
Yeah. So it's actually a lot of the critical infrastructure companies that are most excited about it, even more than the tech companies, but some tech companies are excited about it too. So let's go back to your analogy of dropping the keys everywhere. I'll put that in a little more of a context, which is a critical infrastructure company says to a cybersecurity company that is the member of Glasswing, we have how many new patches are in your patch download? And they say 50. And he's, how can it be 50? You usually have 2 or 3. This is the first of the, and it's going to be 50 for a while. And so we can only deal with 3. Because we have to test all of our systems all over the place and make sure that this works with that. And the response back from the company is it's not going to be just us. Every piece of software you're running is going to have 50 new patches tied to it every week for the foreseeable future. So you have to change the way you're doing patching and have a conversation about that with other people that are dealing with the same thing so that maybe you can find out where there are areas where things have gone down or where things have not interacted well or which patches we really need to prioritize, because on top of this, the scoring system for vulnerabilities has been known to be not great for many years. And
Can you use the scoring system for those who aren't familiar?
Yeah, so the CVSS is the current scoring system that's used, and there's several groups of people that are involved in coming up with this scores. This is involved in DHS, and NIST is involved in some way as well to bring things into the National Vulnerability Database. And all this is run by MITRE as a contractor. And they have a board that oversees some of this as well. And so they take in the vulnerabilities and they rate them based on how much impact they think that this thing's going to have and how likely it is to be exploitable. We've already said if a vulnerability comes from Mythos, it is exploitable. The problem with the Mythos that we've seen is, from what I've heard, about 15% of the vulnerabilities that they have are these chained vulnerabilities, which basically take what used to be considered low-scoring vulnerabilities and chain them together so that they become critical, like to the highest level of things that need to be addressed. So you have to figure out a way to break the chain of these low vulnerabilities, et cetera. So there's a complex feeling series here where you're like, we scored this low, but it's not about that. It's about the risk behind it. And so you saw, and the DHS just put out a new binding operational directive to agencies. So to get a little bit ahead here, basically talking about the risk and the risk involved. And part of that is they're saying, don't just look at the CVSS score. You have to put it in a broader context. And so a clearinghouse could certainly help people to put things into a better context in terms of that risk, as well as just the sharing of the patches and things like that.
And so Ari's already brought us to one of the reasons why I needed an acronym chart was I wasn't sure what the BOD was. And the first thing I read, I was like, what's a BOD? Binding Operational Directive. So you can add that too.
There's a reason that we came up with that term, binding operational. Originally, they want to use guidance, but guidance is used by 12 different places. So they try to come up with.
I'm sure you all been in many rooms where you had to decide that one word and then you fight about it for an hour. That's what we ended up with.
Yeah, that's what happened.
Okay. But the other part of the BOD is it requires a 3-day remediation vulnerability, which there have been decades of conversation about the timing and why that's a challenge. I actually met with a woman, I think she was from Estonia a couple of years ago, and she said, I don't understand why it takes you guys so long. We can do it in 4 hours. And I was like, you can walk across your country in 4 hours. So I can see why maybe you could hand deliver it. So there's a lot of challenges, and we'll get into that. But just so we put that in context, because I realize for some of you, this is a lot of new information coming over. Any other thoughts on where we're headed on the clearinghouse? And
I think I can take a stab. Just looking at the text of the EOs, trying to get reminded, what does it say about forming an AI cybersecurity clearinghouse, volunteer collaboration with the AI industry, operators of critical infrastructure? All sounds good. What are they going to do? Coordinate and deconflict scanning for vulnerabilities, And then we move into discovers and validates such vulnerabilities. Validation is incredibly important. Coordinates and prioritizes remediation and distribution of vulnerability patches. So as I read that clause, I really hope that the second half of that sentence, or the middle third and then the last third of that sentence, gets a lot of institutional airtime and development in the clearinghouse. Because to the points we've been hearing on the panel so far, I think probably whatever the coordination mechanism is, whether it's the sort of ISAC model we've seen, presumably faster and more flexible clearinghouse that's being stood up now, they're probably not going to lack for information routing to one another about vulnerabilities. What would be great to see as well is information routing about how have we used AI to automate the management problems on the patch side, the human institutional managed side. Let's have sharing on that. So as much sharing, I think, on remediation as on spotting the vulnerabilities and sharing them is going to be important. That sounds obvious, but I think it's the second problem is the harder problem. And so my hope is that's where the clearinghouse is going to put a lot of institutional oomph.
And Liz, is this an opportunity? Do you want to talk about your paper to the Aspen Digital paper as well?
No, I would love to. Thanks, Shane. So as I mentioned, one of the issues that we've been grappling with is just as a critical infrastructure provider, making sure that we have access to these technologies before they fall into the hands of adversaries, and thinking through a way to do this. Because as we're seeing, these French AI models are surfacing vulnerabilities at scale. So my colleagues and I, including our Chief Information Security Officer, Nupro Davis, we recently laid out in a paper for the Aspen Institute, Aspen Digital, a responsible advanced access model for critical infrastructure providers that takes the deliberations away from a single organization. The way that it works right now is you have a company, I don't mean to pick on Anthropic, but the Glasswing program had gotten a lot of attention, obviously. But you have one individual company that no matter how well-intentioned, there are 16 critical infrastructure sectors. And there are a lot of interdependencies between the critical infrastructure sectors that one organization sitting in its own corner of the economy is not going to fully understand and appreciate. And so what we're calling for is some sort of process that takes it out of the hands of an individual actor and makes it a transparent and public and accountable process in partnership with the sectors, in partnership with the sector coordinating councils, to determine which critical infrastructure actors are best positioned to be able to have early access to these models. Because what happens now is you have a national security issue with these advanced frontier models. So we want to really make sure that the collective defense of critical infrastructure enables operators to respond to the vulnerabilities and coordinate ecosystem-wide efforts before the vulnerabilities can be exploited by those who want to cause harm.
Kate, any comments on all this stuff or view stuff?
From our perspective, we welcome the executive order. It really does set out a goal to put AI in the hands of cyber defenders, and we're committed to doing our part to do that. We have our AI threat defense capabilities through Google Cloud that puts what I was talking about, CodeMender, looking at the ability to not just identify but fix. Big Sleep finds vulnerabilities. Wiz, the same way you're talking about the looking across an environment where those vulnerabilities can add up. Our Wiz capability helps to look at that and really what are those exposed attack paths and sever those attack paths. So I think we welcome the executive order and look forward to continuing the conversation and the collaboration on it.
To put this in context, I'm actually going to tell you a story on AI. So I came from a tech company that had an entire security division. Everybody in the company took security it was critical. There was no question about it. It was top priority. So when it came to risk, we thought of it as a number one risk. And then I joined the think tank, and one of my friends from the cybersecurity space called me and said, it's not just you. They're doing it to all the think tanks on Massachusetts Avenue because the Chinese think that we're all an arm of the government. Not true. But he said, actually, they've broken into your system, and I can see that they're monitoring your systems at AEI right now. I'm like, cool, okay. So I walk up, and I'm going to talk to the head of IT, but along the way, I run into the former president of AEI, Arthur Brooks. You guys might know, he did a book with Oprah recently. And Arthur Brooks stops me and he goes, what are you working on? And I said, the Chinese are in our system. And he goes, cool, they're in our papers? Full stop. I couldn't get him to care after that. And I was like, Arthur, we had an IT problem. And he was like, it doesn't sound like it to me. So you do, depending on where you are, there's a differencing of opinions as to how important this is. And sometimes it's monitoring, some of it's just a very laissez-faire, hey, it's not bothering me today. So we had to go from that. So I'm going to go from that to one of the challenges is that we're seeing, we've got this clearinghouse, which is great. And then for those who are familiar with the information sharing advisory committees or councils, the ISACs, which are housed over at the Department of Homeland Security, there are layers to them. Very beginning of this process was in the telecom space back when they broke up AT&T, because think about it, old school AT&T, they just had a relationship with the government. They knew everything was going on. It was easy. And then they broke up AT&T. There were new companies and they had to figure out, all right, how do we manage information flow? And then they created, was it telecommunications? It was the first ISAC. And then during COVID, there's several of them now. We created an IT ISAC when people started to realize IT was separate from telecom. There became one actually for hospitality. So there's a hospitality ISAC because they realized there were all these similar things they could learn if you were a restaurant, you were a hotel, you were a shopping mall, where you had to start thinking about things. So it started to really raise the level of interest of people information sharing. But there's two challenges to information sharing that lawyers think about. One is liability, and the other one is, can they get indemnified from that liability? So the ISACs have that capability. It's one of the reasons why you join one of these information sharing capability things. And so the president in the earlier, because it was last November, announced in one of the plans that he wanted to create an artificial intelligence AI ISAC. And now I feel like there's a delta between what we're seeing in the EO and the ISAC. And part of that is it goes around the incident reporting requirements. And depending on how important this is to you, back to my example, might be very important, and others will be like, I'm not going to take the risk. It's just not that important to my industry, or maybe it hasn't been made out how important it is to it. So any thoughts on the kind of challenge of all these tools that are being brought forward, and which ones do you feel like you should really be using and which ones the government should be promoting?
So one thing that I would like to mention, just in this environment, we're seeing some really creative and collaborative models for public-private partnerships. The communication sector recently launched, it's called the C2 ISAC, which works as a complementary body to the communications sector ISAC. And the C2 ISAC is focused solely on cybersecurity, threat information sharing, whereas the original ISAC does both physical and cybersecurity. Our sister is actually the vice chair of the organization. I know Ari has his members' new organization as well. So I think coming up with these new forums and elaborating on the public-private model that we're seeing, just so we are able to do this in a way where there is liability protection and robust information sharing is really critical.
I'm interested in Ari's take on this question too, but I don't necessarily see the ISACs and the EOs as in conflict or overlapping. There's a need for vulnerability handling where existing kind of disclosure processes aren't suited for whatever reason, and there's a need for broader set of information sharing. I do think that there are issues that an AI ISAC could discuss. Adversarial distillation of models is an example of that, but also aware that AI threats are not limited. They're not happening in just an AI world. They're happening in the financial sector, in the health sector, and all the other critical infrastructure sectors where there's a need for ISAC. So just making sure that information sharing is happening at all the levels that it needs to happen.
I think that they're both a little confusing because actually the first AI EO that the Trump administration put out had the AI ISAC in it, and this new security EO has this clearinghouse in it. And both of them are written at a very high level. So I think people are seeing what they want to see out of both of them. And so there are visions certainly that you could have where these two are totally clashing, and then there's visions where they are exactly the same thing. So it's hard to know. So I don't want to state anything with a so strong, because it depends on how these things are rolled out more than what each of our individual visions of them is. I would say the people that I talked to, there was concern originally about the idea of the AI ISAC because the way that it's written in the EO, it is run by DHS, where the ISACs that have been successful have almost all been private sector created with public sector partnerships. So, and this idea of, DHS is going to create, CIS is going to create a AI ISAC caused some consternation in that discussion. That's not to say that it has to be done that way or that they can't just have it as their partnership. It has been made more complicated, I think, for them to do public-private partnerships, though, because Secretary Noem canceled the advisory body for critical infrastructure to work with CISA, what's called the CPAC. They canceled it in like March, and then in April, she said within the quarter it would come back. It still has not come back, and she's no longer the secretary. We are expecting it to happen over the summer, that we will have something that will have that public-private partnership. I think that will bring a lot more comfort to people about how this thing might work and how the coordination might work with it within the ISAC, and we'll be able to have a better understanding of what CISA's role really is in that ISAC. But meanwhile, I think that the idea of pulling together a clearinghouse and figuring out what we want to do with the clearinghouse, and then we can figure out a role for the AI ISAC as it comes together, could make it work very seamlessly, as Kate described. So,
yeah, lots of interesting stuff to pick up on in the response. And I'll just take one thread from your question, which is, what are the incentives that you want to see to enable maximum sharing of information? Whether it's a clearinghouse, whether it's an ISAC, I think traditionally what we've seen is the importance of safe harbors and liability protections. I don't align with industry on everything in the tech policy space, but I do align quite a lot with the need to say, look, if you're going to ask companies to potentially take on exposure to liability, to take on reputational risk in sharing information, I guess to some extent, perhaps competitive sensitivity and proprietary information as well, then you're going to need to also build some legal protective mechanisms into that architecture to ensure and incentivize people want to come forward to the table with their problems. And that's, I'm trying to up-level this a little bit for the audiences that are really in the weeds technically and those that might not be. It makes intuitive sense. Why it is an uncomfortable thing to do as an institution or an individual to say, I've had this problem, I've either fixed it, I don't know how to fix it, this is the nature of the problem, I'm sharing it with you all so that you can figure out how to deal with it as well, but also to help me deal with it. If you put that in a very human individual context, it's a vulnerable thing to do. It is also, from a corporate structure perspective, a vulnerable thing to do. So I think this question of how do we maximize the incentives to do this in an open way and then to share information about what the problems are and how to remediate them, incredibly important. So I also, like Ari, don't pretend to know. I just can't figure it out, and there's not that much text to figure it out from what exact relationship is between the clearinghouse model in this EO and the ISAC model in the earlier EO. But I think the point that there should be genuine public-private partnership, and as a civil society rep, maybe we'll get to this a little bit later, some role in the overall kind of sharing and remediation and policy prioritization environment for civil society as well. I think those things are important. Wouldn't want it to see.
and I just want to just pick up on the point that you made about the safe harbor. We have that in place. That's the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. And if there's one thing I would say to the staffers here, Congress, the one most important thing to do is to reauthorize the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. It applies to AI vulnerabilities as much as regular vulnerabilities. They're the same types of vulnerabilities. We know that it works. It's been in place now for 11 years. It had to be reauthorized last year, and Congress did it for months at a time rather than just doing it for 10 years again or just doing it forever. But that would be the one thing that Congress can do, is to reauthorize the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act for a long period of time.
Plus one.
For those of you, that's the CISA versus CISA 15 that you might be following in your offices. Okay, great. So if you could tell this room the single most important thing you can do. So we've got CISA. Is there anything else that they should be doing? Is there new legislation? Chairman Olbernotti put out a bill this week. Senate had a hearing yesterday about this, actually in the banking committee. So it's beyond just IT thought. It's all the other industry people as well. So give the people in the room some counsel here.
That bill, the Olbernotti bill, one thing that I would point out I liked about it, it has a security section. I think it's good. And that section has an open source viewpoint, which you raised very briefly at the beginning of this. And open source is a real problem here because they don't have the kind of funding or attention. So when you find a vulnerability there, it can take a very long time to get a patch. So having an exploit immediately, and we know it's in open source and it's affecting 80% of all code base, that seems like something we want to prioritize to fix. And if there's no one there to do it, we're in a big trouble. So the idea of like, how do we get resources into open source? How do we get people that do code to go and work with them? How do we get money for them to use AI tools like we were talking about before? I think that's all going to be important in this discussion.
And I would add to that, the Olbernotti Tri-Hand bill contemplates an early access regime for certain open source maintainers. The executive order contemplates an early access regime for federal agencies. We think that this is a really good start and important steps in the right direction, but it's still critical that critical infrastructure organizations have early access to these technologies as well.
I would say maybe stepping back from a broader perspective, you don't have to be using the absolute frontier to really make progress on AI for cyber defense. And so looking at ways, whether through procurement or supporting digital modernization efforts, to use the cloud, software as a service, platforms as a service, all those things are going to help put AI cyber tools in the hands of defenders. And I think that's a priority.
Yeah, good points here to pick up on. That last point from Kate is important too, because I think I don't have now the site handy, but it was either, I think, an Anthropic or an OpenAI report that basically said, we found all these vulnerabilities, but like many of the ways to fixing some of them still are relatively basic. So there are a lot of areas where we need to throw nerd harder problems, more powerful tools from a cyber defense perspective. Cannot afford to forget the sort of rudiments of cybersecurity that we have seen in the last couple of decades be the sources of catastrophic hacks. I think that's a fair point. Specifically to your point, like what should Congress do? I think, Ari, I agree with what you're saying, like fund and staff that remediation layer, particularly for open source vulnerabilities. I think building institutional capacity through resources there is something Congress can certainly do. And then I'll offer a larger point that's agnostic about specific legislative vehicle for it, because I think it's also a political and a messaging point. And I said it a little bit at the beginning. This is a really important time in the cybersecurity space and dealing with the vulnerabilities and the challenges we've all been talking about to unite the consumer protection and the national security constituencies around consensus on the need to move quickly and to coordinate. Because I think depending on where you sit, depending on the institution that you staff or sort of care most about, you think of this as a potentially a hard security problem, the type that calls to mind nation state exploiting and the geopolitical competition context. And you're absolutely right. It's that. Vulnerability exploits are very much going to be consumer harm areas. It's going to be the people who are denied loans, the people who are defrauded. It's going to be power outages from cybersecurity vulnerabilities that affect people and businesses. And so these are, I think, like, it makes sense at some level that in a specialized context, you think national security and the associated architecture and equities here, and you think consumer protection and the associated equities and architecture here. But I think this is a moment where we've got to also build bridges across those constituencies to tackle cybersecurity vulnerabilities at scale and the human coordination problems that go with them. So that's the broader point I wanted to make as well.
And then in adjacent, only in that from a legislative perspective, it's adjacent, but the question of data security or privacy, I think of it as data security because I think privacy is an emotion. I also think that we should have a national privacy bill, and one of my other colleagues at AEI thinks, no, we've done a great job. Finance has got their things, health has theirs, so we have varying points of view. Thoughts on, is a national privacy bill something that would help this process as well, because you'd have more symmetry in the information flow? Because the whole point, there's two reasons to steal things online, or is you want the data, but you really want the data because you want the money, or if you can just straight up steal the money, it's easier. But a lot of times the data is the money. So thoughts on that?
Yes, we need a national privacy law like the Secure Data Act.
Anybody else want to weigh in? Just nods.
Strongest last one on the need for comprehensive national privacy law. OTI has been beating that drum along with lots of partners across civil society for many years. And I think one of the things we've emphasized, we do not endorse the Secure Data Act, and we can debate what's the right way to do it. But I will say the fundamental understanding that not every cybersecurity problem is a privacy problem and vice versa, but privacy and security are often two sides of the same coin. And so you can't hack data that isn't collected or retained. That's a very important sort of simple security maxim, which I think I trotted out a couple of years ago when testifying, when APRA had its emergence, and there was a hearing on sort of the security, data security aspects of thinking through a privacy law. And I think this is a great time, if whether your lens is consumer protection and privacy first, or whether it's data security first, to be reminded of and to continue to beat the drum. We do need, for a number of sort of people and system security protective reasons, a credible privacy law in this country.
Okay. Questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So this discussing between about our institutions is very great, especially from like professional capital capacity perspective. CEO have capacity. But it's going to be a sensitive process. It's going to be responsible to hire people as well. Institutional capacity really go into that. Given all that is that they're facing, how optimistic are you about the executive borders dealing with issues? Or do we need a lot more similar organizational legislation to get work done actually visible for that?
Basically, is the EO covering the ground that we need for it to right now, or do we need to have more of an actual legislated stronghold on this?
I think there's going to be a lot of work ahead in the next 12 to 18 months, and welcome the EO as part of that. I do think that there's reason for optimism in that medium long-term time frame, but in the 12 to 18 month time frame, we'll be adjusting and adapting. But I think as we work through that, and that's going to be a hard period of time, but it is nice to see that the technology is there to help take us to the other side of it.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Kate said, but I probably put it in slightly stronger words, which is like the short term is unfathomably bad. Like we don't know what's going to happen and none of it looks very good. The medium term, it starts to say, okay, now we can see a picture where how to get from the bad to the good. But the long term is much better than it was a year ago because we can actually see a point where cybersecurity, people say, well, we're going to solve cybersecurity. We're not solving cybersecurity because you still have insider threat. You still have all sorts of these things that and other types of AI security issues that you're going to run into. There's still going to be cybersecurity issues, but the random vulnerability and like unpatched thing that just was there, that eventually long-term looks like it could all go away, which would be pretty good. Cybersecurity would be different than it is today, and that's positive. So if you want a positive view, think very long-term. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the other positive view is that nothing galvanizes disparate, divided constituencies like a crisis. And so I think we can do more than hope. We can certainly hope that the sense of emerging crisis or crisis that is already here, to Ari's point, we're going to have a really tough short-term period ahead. I think that seems inevitably true, but let's hope that galvanizes an appropriate response. And not to repeat myself a little bit too much on this subject, but I think it's galvanizing in a way. We talk a lot in tech policy circles about like, how come tech and tech policy never seem like kitchen table politics issues or political issues? I think occasionally they do, but people see kitchen table issues through the lens of what affects them directly. And rarely are you saying, I'm worried about my economic security, let me think about tech policy. But I do think that AI cybersecurity vulnerabilities and cascading vulnerabilities around systems that are potentially going to touch lots of people's lives in the ordinary course of living and working and playing and going to school and that sort of thing, that's an opportunity to galvanize broader momentum to make progress in areas where, as we've all been talking about, sometimes the human coordination problems are the hardest. I don't know how to rate the prospects for that optimism playing out, but I think we've all got to be doing what we can to make that more of a reality than not.
This has nothing to do with that your particular question, except for you reminded me. So when I go out to my dad's side of the family is from Denver, and a lot of times my aunt and uncle will be there, and I make them immediately put all of their phones out, and I know that none of them have changed their password or their code since I was last there. And I was like, nope, wait a minute. Everybody has to be updated before I'll because they just show up. I'm like, tech support showed up, and I'm like, I am not fixing anyone's phone until you update your software. And they're like, I don't know, that's important to you. I'm like, it's really important. And I actually talk about policy all the time. Lucky you have other conversations. I don't know what there's. Thank you. Other questions?
Just on that, one thing we haven't said is remember the basics.
Yeah.
The basics, cybersecurity, secure by design, password management, two-factor authentication, all those things.
Lower hanging fruit.
As relevant as ever.
I would say use two-factor authentication. You're just that much harder to get into than the guy who didn't.
People say, even people that I'm talking to, they still say identity is the number one issue for exploits that they have. And even with this today, that might change in the next few months, but it is still will remain important eternally.
The basics.
So, yeah.
Others? You said you might have a question, but were we so good you don't even have a question? This team, all right. So then the last question to you all. Summer reading, what are you going to recommend? What a paper that Liz worked on. So Aspen Digital.
Yes.
Okay. And it starts with an R.
Responsible advanced access.
See, that's beach reading, kids. That's good stuff. All right.
It is beach reading.
All right. Bram, anything you've got in the works everybody should be reading?
That we've got in the works. We've done some work recently, a paper that we can share if it's helpful on AI agents. Actually, one of the things we didn't bring up in this conversation too much, although I think Kate mentioned it earlier on, is like vulnerabilities raised by the agentic ecosystem and free-flowing data exchanges there introduces a whole set of vulnerabilities that we shouldn't forget about even as we're thinking about cybersecurity problems posed by frontier models in certain contexts. So I can share that paper around. We'll have more building on it to come. But I thought you were asking about what to read in the book.
I mean, you could. Actually, it was no, but you could have taken in any direction, but you liked the direction I wanted you to go.
Yeah.
Kate might have a novel. She took off a plane. I don't know.
Yeah. I have an on-topic and an off-topic reading. So on topic, if you want to learn more about the way in which threat actors are using it, we have a report on that. We are also just developing a policy paper about ideas for policymakers on how to navigate this moment. But since my red eye was coming back from Santa Barbara and our quantum lab, I do want to just mention we did a blog a little while ago on quantum computing and the timelines around the need to shift systems to post-quantum cryptography so that they are resilient to quantum computers that eventually will be able to break encryption. And the research on that is accelerating timelines and the possibility of quantum computers that are able to break encryption. The number of qubits that are needed to do that are decreasing. The hardware and the error correction in quantum is advancing rapidly. So we recently announced that we were going to migrate to 2029. And I only say this as if we weren't all consumed by AI and cyber right now, we should also really be thinking about how do we incentivize that preparation for quantum computing 2029, especially when we're talking about 12 months chaos. Feels like impossibly long, but it's really not that long. And so we need to think about moving forward on that with urgency.
Just a strong +1 on that case.
It's definitely an area that we need more investment as well, is the move to quantum. I will say that one thing that we didn't touch on as much because we're focused on protecting critical infrastructure here is fraud and scams. And we're looking a lot more into fraud and scams because internationally it's moved to be the number one cybersecurity issue, whereas ransomware was number one. Ransomware is still happening all the time, and the bad guys are finding different ways of getting in, and they're using AI to get in as well. But frauds and scams clearly are using a lot more AI, and it's going to get worse. And it's not protecting critical infrastructure, so it's not going to be as protected, and it's going to trick a lot of people into turning over money online through frauds and scams. I would look at the reporting that the New York Times did at the beginning of this year on frauds and scams in China in particular. China and Burma are the two places where they have these kind of slave trade that goes on related to putting people into these kind of work sites where they are scamming and frauding people from around the world, Europeans and Americans mostly, which seems totally bizarre. They actually went in and have cameras going into these places, and you can see it yourself, and it's pretty crazy. But that's getting bigger and bigger, costing more money. People around the world are trying to come up with legislation to stop it. We have an executive order here that has come out. I think it's only going to get to be a bigger topic, and AI is feeding into it.
Wired Magazine has done some really good pieces on that, especially the pig butchering situation.
There's actually a bunch of cybersecurity companies that have written their own reports on it, but the Wired and the New York Times quote all those. So those are your sources. Yeah.
Great. Thank you to the panel. You guys have been amazing. Thank you all for being here. And thank you for Tim and Ryan and all the work that the Internet Caucus does. I am absolutely available. All of the people here would love to hear from you, but if you want to learn more, there's something, or there's just, because I realize this is a lot, please feel free to reach out to us or get a hold of us via Tim and all the great work he does. So you guys have a great weekend.